Consciousness disclosed this antithesis through action. Acting in accordance with the knowledge revealed, it finds out that knowledge is deceptive, and being committed as regards the content of that knowledge to one of the attributes of substance, it violated the other and so gave it the right as against itself. In following the God that knows, it really got hold of what was not revealed and pays the penalty of trusting a knowledge whose ambiguity, for such is its nature, also becomes explicit for consciousness and a warning to it. The ravings of the priestess, the inhuman shape of the witches, the voices of trees and birds, dreams and so forth, are not the ways in which truth manifests itself. They are the warning signs of deception, of an absence of self-possession, of the singularity and contingency of the knowing. Or, in other words, the opposite power which is violated by consciousness is present as express law and valid right, whether law of the family or of the state. Consciousness, on the other hand, followed its own way of knowing and concealed from itself what was openly revealed. The truth, however, from the opposing powers of the content of the knowledge and of consciousness is the result that both are equally right, and therefore in their antithesis, which is brought about by action, are equally wrong. The action in being carried out demonstrates their unity in the natural downfall of both powers and both self-conscious characters. The reconciliation of the opposition with itself is the lethe of the underworld in death, or the lethe of the upper world is absolution, not from guilt, for consciousness cannot deny its guilt because it committed the act, but from the crime. Both are oblivion, the vanishness of the reality and the action of the powers of substance, of their individualities, and of the powers of the abstract thought of good and evil. For none of them by itself is the essence, which rather is the repose of the whole within itself, the unmoved unity of fate, the peaceful existence, and consequent inactivity and lack of vitality of family and government, and the equal honor and consequent indifferent unreality of Apollo and the Furies, and the return of their spiritual life and activity into the unitary being of Zeus. There is a lot going on in paragraph 740, and what you notice is that Hegel is referencing the schemas that he's worked out in the last several paragraphs, particularly the previous paragraph where there were all of these associations of three things connected with each other that we had to plot out. And much of that schema is being retained, but now all of the things are being put into different relations with each other, and in particular with acting, Handelnde, consciousness, Bewusstsein, leading ultimately to talking about Zeus, and we'll get to that in a moment. When you think Zeus in this case, though, as where we're headed, don't think about the usual depictions of him as the, big white-haired guy in a toga throwing lightning bolts or any of that sort of stuff. Think God, because that's Zeus, part of what it means within a philosophical context and also within certain religious contexts. It's coming from the word for God in Greek, and that's part of what's going on here, according to Hegel, in the transformation that's happening in Greek tragedy as we're going to move to comedy. So let's pick up at the very start. He says, consciousness disclosed this antithesis through action. Antithesis in this case is Gegensatz, and as opposed to other possibilities. So Gegensatz, there's an opposition of, you could say, frameworks to each other. I think that we can also read into this the gazettes of law that's going to be talked about quite a lot a little bit later in this paragraph. So we have laws that are also opposed to each other, or moral norms opposed to each other. So consciousness disclosed this through action, through acting in a coherent, intentional way, in a meaningful way, we might say. Acting in accordance with the knowledge revealed, right, the knowledge that has been opened up to it. There's a lot of opening and hiding and concealing language going on in this as well. It finds out that the knowledge is deceptive. So what it took originally as being certain, if we want to use the Hegelian schema of moving from certainty to truth, right? Gewissheit to Wahrheit, and then back again. We're finding that the truth of things is that they're not as certain as we thought they were. And he's going to frame this in terms of the God who knows. And God here can be not just, God is Zeus. As a matter of fact, we're talking about God, you might say even lowercase g in this case. He says, in following the God that knows, it really got hold of what was not revealed. And here we're going to see this term, Offenbarung, right? That is going to show up in just a few more paragraphs when we get to the revealed religion, right? The religion of revelation. So we have this dialectic, as we've seen before. In trusting the God who seems to know, we're trusting something that's not completely clear here, something that hasn't been revealed, that might be the opposite of what we think. The oracle is a fine example of this. Don't trust the words of the oracle because they usually get you into some sort of trouble. So backing up a little bit, being committed, he says, as regards the content, the inhalt of that knowledge to one of the attributes of substance, namely one of the things that it could have understood and mastered, he says it violated the other and gave it the right as against itself. This is one of those you can't win sort of situations. Or as we say sometimes, damned if you do, damned if you don't, or you're just screwed, right? It's not quite a catch-22 because that has a complex circular structure. In this case, it's rather diffused. Consciousness cannot, even though it's being earnest, even though it is acting with good intentions, it cannot take into account everything that it ought to as it acts. So in acting, it screws up no matter what, no matter who it trusts. And going back to the reference to Hamlet earlier on, a few paragraphs back, when Hegel was saying, well, this is a more sophisticated attitude, that doesn't work either. Because not acting until you get more information, that is also a way of acting. And so you're going to find yourself drawn willy-nilly into one side or the other. So the grand total of this is you can't act in any way that is not going to bring about some sort of opposition and catastrophe. So it violates the other, gives it the right to itself. So coming back to this side, in following the God it knows, it got a hold of what was not revealed and pays the penalty of trusting a knowledge whose ambiguity, we're going to come back to that, for such as its nature, also becomes explicit for consciousness and a warning to it. So ambiguity. Now this becomes apparent to consciousness, but all too late. The oracle said this, and then you act, and then you're like, oh, crap, it actually meant this instead. Right? Now, this is not a tragic example. This is actually from history, but think about the story of Priestess, who is the king of Lydia, a very powerful kingdom in what is nowadays Turkey, and the Persians are rising as a power, and he's thinking, maybe I should crush them. So he sends to the Greek oracle, and he says, should I fight the Persians? And the oracle says, if you do, a great kingdom will be destroyed. Now he thinks, well, that must be the Persians, because I'm going to destroy them. And as it turns out, nope, that's his own kingdom that's going to be destroyed. And so this is a prime example of finding out this ambiguity only too late. We also have a similar ambiguity in the oracle that is given to Oedipus that then he acts upon, fleeing his adoptive father and mother. He winds up killing his birth father and marrying his birth mother trying to not bring about the oracle, he actually brings it about. We might also think, now Hegel's not talking about this, but it's kind of on my mind, about the famous oracle that Socrates himself did not consult, but his friend, kind of a smartass, at Delphi says, is Socrates the wisest man? And the oracle says, there's nobody wiser than Socrates. And then Socrates is like, what the hell could that mean? Let me go and prove by disproving, these are modes of Handeln, action, the oracle. I'm going to go and find somebody who's really smart, and then I'll certainly see that I'm not as wise as they are. And it turns out that nobody's actually wise. And Socrates comes to the conclusion, I'm wise in that I know the limits of my own knowledge and wisdom, and these other schmucks don't. Right? There's an ambiguity there, as maybe actually not just a single ambiguity, but nested ambiguities. And we should talk about this term, Zweideutigkeit, right? Two possible meanings in the same thing, or maybe multiple meanings. We use other words besides ambiguous, like polysemous, sort of a related idea. It means different things, signifies different things. And that's what's happening here. There's a signification that's taking place. What are the examples that he gives? The ravings of the priestess. Okay, that's the oracle, right? The inhuman shape of the witches, the voices of trees and birds, dreams, and so forth, are not the ways in which truth manifests itself. They are taken as ways in which truth manifests itself. That's why people consult them, right? And if you think about the many different ways in which divination or consulting the spiritual powers can take place, ranging from examining the guts of animals, to looking at the flights of birds, to casting yarrow straws, or flipping coins, or, rolling dice, or any of these sorts of things, they are marked by a very strong ambiguity, and there's a disconnect with truth. Instead, he says, they are warning signs of deception, of an absence of self-possession, of the singularity and contingency of the knowing. Isn't this interesting? The knowing itself is not a reliable knowledge of truth. Instead, it's deception, it's singular and contingent. And he says, or, here we move to the next part, in other words, the opposite power, which is violated by consciousness, is present as expressed law and valid right. So, is that a pleonasm there? Is he saying the same thing twice? Express law and valid right, gültige Recht, right? Gesetz for law. Or are these two aspects of the same thing? Well, he's going to talk about two laws, right? The law of the state and the law of the family that we've encountered from the beginning of the Spirit section, in which the discussion was the conflict between the law of the state, something that was in fact open, public, and then the law of the family, which is also the law of the gods. And we saw this clash in the tragedy Antigone, but we can see this in others as well. And the acting consciousness is getting itself in trouble with both of these now. Now the acting consciousness is not taking the side of the law of the state, as, for example, Creon, right? Or the law of the family, as, for example, Antigone, right? Or something else. As a matter of fact, who would be a prime example of this? Hymen, the son of Creon, who is an acting consciousness, who tries to remonstrate with his father and argue him into not taking this stand against Antigone, who he's engaged to, and then goes and attacks his father and also kills himself, right? Violating both of these laws, leaving Creon in ruin. Well, I mean, that's one example among many that we might be able to bring up. What's lacking there, of course, is the consultation of the gods in that case. But he says the opposite power is present as whether law of the family or of the state. Consciousness, on the other hand, followed its own way of knowing and concealed from itself what was openly revealed. Now that's an interesting thing to say, because what that implies is that in these tragedies, if the character was looking closely enough, if they proceeded in a more cautious manner, maybe they could have seen what was not being made explicit, what was not revealed, before it came to bite them. And then maybe they wouldn't be in conflict with these things. But that's not how action really works in drama. Frankly, in a lot of history either. It's pretty rare that people are wise and cautious, right? So he goes on and he says, the truth of the opposing powers of the content of the knowledge and of consciousness is the result, this is very important, both are equally right. Everybody's got some rightness on their side. Nobody's completely right. So it's impossible, and this really is the tragic situation, it's impossible to do justice, to reconcile the truth of all of these voices, all of these legitimate ethical powers or forces or living norms. And so he says, therefore, in their antithesis, in the Gegensatz between them, the opposition between them, both are equally wrong. Now, who's actually going to have to pay for being wrong? The laws don't pay anything, right? The laws are what they are. And that's because unless they are embodied in a consciousness, embodied in somebody who acts on behalf of them, they can't pay any penalty. Creon, in being the law of the state in the Antigone, he can pay a penalty. His family is ruined, right? He's lost everything, and he didn't solve the messed up situation that his brother-in-law / nephew, Oedipus, left behind, right? We could say similar things about other tragedies as well. When somebody does embody the law of the family, as Antigone did, or the law of the state, then the law can actually pay for being wrong. So like it says, the action in being carried out demonstrates their unity in the natural downfall of both powers and both self-conscious characters. And here's where we're getting ready to move beyond tragedy. Hegel doesn't want to just say, well, in the ancient world we had, the religion of art, and when we get to the point of language, we have three main kinds of language. Epic, that's cool. Tragedy, that's cooler yet. Comedy, well, that's coolest, but also kind of a end of all of this. No, he has to show some intrinsic connection between these, at least conceptual connections, if not historical connections, and that is part of what he's doing by talking about the downfall here of both powers. And then he talks about reconciliation, the reconciliation of the opposition with itself, and here he uses this term lethe. Lethe is a legendary river, but it's also a concept, forgetfulness. It comes from the word lanthanen, to conceal, right? And Heidegger is going to make a lot out of this, right? Truth as aletheia, unforgetting, unconcealing. Hegel's not yet working with this. He's thinking about this in terms of actual forgetting or wiping away or dealing with things in such a way that there's no longer a crisis going on between them. So there's two different possibilities here. We have a lower possibility and we have a higher possibility. He says the lethe of the underworld, the reconciliation takes place in death. And we do have characters die and they go to the underworld, and that's that. And in the underworld, what sort of existence do they have? Now, this is actually coming, I'm going to take something here that's a really interesting suggestion from a fantasy series, Ursula K. Le Guin, where she has the dry land. And she says that the people who continue on there as shades exist only as names and shadows. Isn't that a brilliant way of talking about the Greek underworld? They exist as names and as shadows, as an identity that is not the totality of who they were, and as shadows, not living people. Okay, so that's one side. And Hegel's going to leave that behind at this point, because that's not where the attention really is going to focus. He says, or the lethe of the upper world, as absolution. Absolution. Now notice what he says here. Not from guilt, for consciousness cannot deny its guilt because it committed the act, but from the crime. And so there's a split here, right? The crime, the sin, the hamartia in Greek, the evil deed, the wrong deed, the thing that turned out to be not good but bad, you can be absolved from that. You can't be absolved entirely from the shuld, the guilt, which you carry around yourself. You are the one who accuses yourself. And there is this possibility of absolution. But not only absolution, he says, also the peace of mind following. Now here's a second, a second thing. Atonement for the crime. So it's not just, somebody, maybe a god pronounces, oh, you're absolved, everything's cool. There's also atonement involved. And atonement itself is a further kind of handeln, right? Action. Anybody can be contrite, doing something after you've screwed things up. That's a whole different matter, isn't it? Atoning is something where you have to commit yourself. And he goes on and he says, both are oblivion, the vanishness of the reality and the action of the powers or substance, of their individualities, and of the powers of the abstract thought of good and evil. Why? None of them by itself is the essence. None of them is the Wesen, the essence that we've been looking for, which rather is the repose of the whole within itself. This reconciliation allows the jarring, contradictory whole to actually form something like a system that makes sense. How does he describe this? The unmoved unity of fate, the peaceful existence and consequent inactivity and lack of vitality of family and government. The two laws, right? Or the things representing the two laws, rather. And the equal honor and consequent indifferent unreality of Apollo and the Furies, the god who knows and what was not revealed. All of this becomes kind of flattened out, no longer as effective. And he says, the return of their spiritual life and activity, now we come back to this, into the unitary being of Zeus. And actually Miller's translation, it just says einfach and Zeus, the simple, the one-fold Zeus that is encompassing all of this. Zeus is not a character in this, as he is in some things like Prometheus, bound, or, things like that. In this case, Zeus is a stand-in for fate, for the totality of the system. And we arrive at a point where we can have a sort of quiescence and an acquiescence in what has taken place. And we're beyond, in a certain respect, abstract good and evil. I know that sounds a little Nietzschean, beyond good and evil. We are beyond an abstract way of understanding it because they're made sense of within the entire totality. So we've really come a long ways with what happens in a tragedy, according to Hegel. And this is priming us for being able to say, maybe tragedy wasn't exactly what we thought it was. It does also help to explain one thing that Hegel doesn't talk about here, but referenced earlier, that old idea of tragedy that Aristotle may have originated. He's certainly one of the first people to talk about it, saying that tragedy produces a catharsis, a cleansing, a purification of the spectator of what? Their feelings, their emotions, their pathe of fear and pity. There's nothing left to fear in this vast tableau of interconnected systems, or one system. And is there any pity left to feel as well? Perhaps not. So that is another function of what is going on here. And so, a lot happening. This is a quite important transition paragraph.